From New York, this is Democracy Now!
I'm here today because I don't want any more little angels to suffer the way Marie did, the way I am now. I don't want any more mothers or fathers to lose children. It can't be so hard for a country like the United States to protect children.
A Guatemalan mother testifies on Capitol Hill about how her 19-month-old child died after being jailed in an ICE detention center in Dilley, Texas. This comes as the Trump administration is threatening to launch nationwide immigration raids on Sunday. We'll speak with California Congressmember Nanette Barragan, who visited a migrant child jail in Texas last week. Then to the U.S. women's national soccer team. Chants of equal pay greeted the World Cup champions during their victory celebration in New York. We'll look at what their World Cup win means for the equal pay movement and the future of Title IX. Plus, as Labor Secretary Alex Acosta faces calls to resign over his handling of Jeffrey Epstein's case, Acosta is also facing criticism for cutting the budget to fight international sex trafficking by 80%. We'll get the latest. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta Wednesday defied calls by congressional leaders to resign over the lenient 2008 plea deal he gave to the serial child sex abuser Jeffrey Epstein when Acosta was the U.S. prosecutor in Florida. The plea deal saw Epstein serve a 13-month prison term, though he was allowed to leave jail 6 days a week to work from his private office. He would be picked up by his private chauffeur and returned in the evenings. It's been described as one of the most lenient deals for a serial child sex offender in history. The case drew renewed attention this week when Epstein was charged in a Manhattan federal court with sexually assaulting and trafficking dozens of underage girls between 2002 and 2005 at his homes in Manhattan and Palm Beach, Florida. He's pleaded not guilty. Earlier this year, a federal court ruled Secretary Acosta's team violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act by failing to inform Epstein's survivors about the non-prosecution deal of 2008. Speaking to reporters for nearly an hour Wednesday, Secretary Acosta did not once apologize to Epstein's victims and defended his handling of the case.
We believe that we proceeded appropriately, that based on the evidence, and not just my opinion, but I've shared the affidavit, based on the evidence, there was value to getting a guilty plea and having him register. Look, no regrets is a very hard question.
This comes as another woman, Jennifer Arose, told NBC she was recruited by Epstein when she was just 14 years old. He raped her, she said, in his New York City townhouse when she was 15. She was interviewed by Savannah Guthrie.
In your mind, did you use the word rape? Did you recognize it then as rape?
No, I don't think I did. I just thought, it's my fault. I was, obligated. That's just what you're supposed to do.
On Wednesday, Jennifer Rose asked a New York City court for help in identifying the woman who first recruited her to Epstein's mansion, where he would later rape her. On Capitol Hill, House lawmakers heard heart-wrenching testimony Wednesday from the Guatemalan mother of a toddler who died after she became sick in an ICE jail near the U.S.-Mexico border. Yasmin Juarez says her 18-month-old daughter, Marie, was healthy when she brought her to the U.S. in March seeking political asylum. But 1 week after the pair were jailed at the South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, Texas, the girl developed a cough, diarrhea, and vomiting with a fever that spiked to 104 degrees. Juarez says her daughter received inadequate medical care in the clinic set up in the center's gymnasium. After their release, Juarez rushed her daughter to the emergency room of the local hospital. She spent 6 weeks in the hospital before she died of complications from a deadly lung infection.
All the hard work of these doctors came too late. My Maria died on Mother's Day, on the day that in my city, in my country, we celebrate Mother's Day. When I left the hospital that day, all I had with me was a piece of paper with Maria's handprints in pink paint that the staff had created for me. It was the only thing that I had left, just her handprints. The nurses had made it the previous day as a Mother's Day gift.
Juarez has filed a $60 million lawsuit against the United States for the wrongful death of her daughter, Marie. She was one of 7 children to die in U.S. immigration custody or shortly after release from custody over the past year. Before last year, no child died in U.S. immigration custody in over a decade. Wednesday's hearing on immigration jails came as one of the House Oversight Committee's most prominent members, New York's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, called for the Department of Homeland Security to be dismantled. Speaking with the New Yorker Radio Hour, Ocasio-Cortez repeated her call for the abolition of ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Host David Remnick asked Ocasio-Cortez if she would get rid of the Department of Homeland Security as well.
I think so. I think we need to undo a lot of the egregious mistakes that the Bush administration did. I feel like we are it is a very qualified and supported position, at least in terms of evidence and in terms of being able to make the argument that we never should have created DHS in the early 2000s.
This comes as current and former Homeland Security officials told reporters that ICE is preparing to arrest thousands of undocumented immigrants in sweeps scheduled to begin Sunday. The officials say they'll arrest any immigrants they find, including so-called, quote, collateral deportations. The raids are expected to take place in at least 10 major cities, including Los Angeles, Miami, Atlanta, Chicago, and San Francisco. Many local officials have promised to resist the ICE raids. Meanwhile, Mother Jones is reporting ICE has opened 3 new immigration jails in the Deep South as part of an effort to circumvent a congressional limit on the number of people in U.S. immigration detention. Among them is the Adams County Correctional Center, a Mississippi prison operated by CoreCivic, a for-profit prison corporation. That center has been plagued by reports of inadequate medical care, staff mistreatment, and rotten food, and was home to a prison riot in 2012 that left a guard dead. ICE is currently holding some 54,000 people in its jails, an all-time high and far more than a target of about 40,000 people set by Congress. In Philadelphia, police arrested 6 immigrant rights activists Wednesday as they held a sit-in protest at Joe Biden's 2020 campaign headquarters. The protesters are demanding Biden apologize for the roughly 3 million deportations that occurred while he served as vice president under President Barack Obama. They're also seeking a commitment by Biden to end immigration detentions and deportations on his first day in office. Freshman Democratic Congressmember Ilhan Omar of Minnesota is calling on advertisers to boycott Tucker Carlson after the Fox News host targeted her in a racist attack on his program Tuesday night. During a 3-minute monologue, Carlson blasted Omar, one of the first 2 Muslim women ever elected to the U.S. Congress, as a living fire alarm and dangerous.
After everything America has done for Omar and for her family, she hates this country more than ever. Ilhan Omar is living proof that the way we practice immigration has become dangerous to this country. She's a living fire alarm, a warning to the rest of us that we better change our immigration system immediately or else.
Minneapolis Congressmember Ilhan Omar tweeted in response, quote, Fox News is now giving a nightly platform to white supremacist rhetoric. It's dangerous. Advertisers should not be underwriting hate speech, she said. Tucker Carlson has a history of racist, xenophobic, misogynistic comments. He recently said immigration makes America poorer and dirtier and more divided, and in 2006 called Iraqis, quote, semi-literate primitive monkeys. The Trump administration's welcoming right-wing media stars to the White House today for a forum billed as a social media summit. Among those invited to attend are Bill Mitchell, a self-described member of the Trump train who's embraced the far-right QAnon conspiracy theory, and Ali Alexander, a far-right activist whose recent tweet smearing Senator Kamala Harris as, quote, not an American black was retweeted, then deleted by Donald Trump Jr. Also joining will be James O'Keefe, a discredited right-wing activist known for targeting Planned Parenthood in Acorn. O'Keefe was famously arrested in Texas for trying to wiretap the office of the former U.S. Senator from Louisiana, Mary Landrieu. A federal appeals court in Virginia has dismissed a lawsuit against President Trump, arguing he broke the Constitution's anti-corruption clauses by profiting from his hotel business in Washington, D.C. A three-judge panel of the Circuit Court of Appeals for the Fourth District, for the Fourth Circuit, ruled that Trump's continued ownership of the Trump International Hotel did not violate the foreign and domestic emoluments clauses of the Constitution. All three judges were nominated by Republican presidents. The Trump Organization has canceled plans to host a charity golf tournament co-sponsored by a Miami-area strip club. Wednesday's move by the Trump National Doral Golf Resort to scrap the planned event this weekend came a day after the Washington Post reported plans to have dancers from the Shadow Cabaret strip club work as so-called caddy girls to VIP guests paying $450. The planned event was to benefit a basketball-themed children's program called Miami All-Stars, which is not registered as a charity in Florida. And when attention was drawn to it yesterday, they pulled out saying they didn't want the money. The FBI on Wednesday arrested 6 people on corruption charges related to Puerto Rico's recovery from Hurricane Maria, including 2 top officials in the administration of Governor Ricardo Rosselló. A 32-count indictment charges the officials, including the former head of Puerto Rico's Health Insurance Administration and the island's former education secretary, with illegally funneling federal funding to politically connected contractors. Following Wednesday's arrests, Arizona Democratic Congressmember Raul Grijalva, who chairs the House committee that oversees Puerto Rico, called on Governor Rosselló to resign. In Louisiana, floodwaters from heavy rains have left much of New Orleans and parts of the Gulf Coast underwater as Tropical Storm Barry churns offshore ahead of its predicted landfall as a Category 1 hurricane Saturday. The storm spawned a waterspout over Lake Pontchartrain Wednesday and left New Orleans' famed Bourbon Street underwater. A senior State Department intelligence analyst has resigned in protest after the Trump administration blocked parts of his written testimony to Congress about the dangers of climate change. In June, analyst Rod Schoonover was permitted to appear before the House Intelligence Committee to testify about the national security risks posed by global warming, but the White House barred him from submitting peer-reviewed scientific journal articles and intelligence reports as evidence to back his claims. Part of his censored testimony to Congress read, quote, absent extensive mitigating factors or events, we see few plausible future scenarios where significant, possibly catastrophic harm does not arise from the compounded effects of climate change, unquote. This comes as a new NASA-funded study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found rising global temperatures from human activity have pushed West Antarctica's Thwaites Glacier to a tipping point that will likely see meltwater from the massive glacier raise global sea levels by about 50 centimeters or more than 1.5 feet. The process could take as little as 150 years. And thousands gathered in Lower Manhattan yesterday to celebrate the U.S. women's national team's historic 4th World Cup soccer championship at a raucous ticker-tape parade. Megan Rapinoe, Alex Morgan, Rose Lavelle and their teammates rode floats through New York City's Canyon of Heroes as supporters chanted USA and equal pay. The parade ended at City Hall, where New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio hosted a ceremony to celebrate the team's 2nd consecutive World Cup win and awarded the athletes the keys to the city. Co-captain, top scorer, and best player Megan Rapinoe addressed the crowd with a message to the team's fans and the country.
We have to be better. We have to love more, hate less. We got to listen more and talk less. We got to know that this is everybody's responsibility, every single person here. every single person who's not here, every single person who doesn't want to be here, every single person who agrees and doesn't agree. It's our responsibility to make this world a better place. I think this team does an incredible job of taking that on our shoulders and understanding the position that we have and the platform that we have within this world.
After the ceremony in New York City, the women's soccer team flew to Los Angeles to attend the ESPY Awards, where they were honored with the Best Team Award. We'll have more on the U.S. women's team and their fight for gender equity later in the broadcast. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The New York Times is reporting the Trump administration is preparing to launch nationwide immigration raids beginning on Sunday to target members of undocumented families. Officials told the Times that immigration and customs enforcement agents will target at least 2,000 immigrants. The raids are expected to take place in at least 10 major cities. The Times reports authorities might detain immigrants who happen to be on the scene, even though they were not targets of the raids. President Trump first publicly threatened to carry out the nationwide raids in June, but then postponed them. This comes as Trump's immigration policies are coming under international criticism. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, has condemned the dire conditions in which jailed migrants are being held in the U.S. and the ongoing separation of children from their families. She warned that the detention of migrant children may constitute cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment that is prohibited by international law.
Meanwhile, congressional lawmakers have decried the conditions where migrant children are being held. The New York Times and the El Paso Times recently revealed there's been an outbreak of scabies, shingles, and chickenpox at a Border Patrol station in Clint, Texas, where hundreds of migrant children have been held without access to sufficient food, water, beds, or medical care. We go now to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Democratic Congresswoman Nanette Barragan of California. Last week, she took part in a congressional delegation that visited that Border Patrol facility in Clint, Texas. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Congressmember. It's great to have you with us. We've just gotten this news of the outbreak of scabies and shingles and chickenpox at that very facility that you visited. Can you describe what you saw?
Well, Amy, there is cells, much like you've seen in some of these advertisements that the Border Patrol is doing. There's about 5 or 6 cells where they're holding children. Now, when we went, they locked the doors so that we could not talk to these children. These are basically prison cells. They're concrete floors. They're bringing in nylon-looking bunk beds. Maybe you get a blanket, but you're locked in a room. If you go to a separate area in the back after you leave the cell area, there's a place that looks almost like a warehouse, and it's hot in there. There are more of these nylon bunk beds, and then there's a whole stack of mats ready for children. Now, when we went, Amy, there was only about 25, 30 children. At the height, they had 700 children, and reports of children who couldn't sleep and couldn't find a place to even lay down. Completely unconscionable and unacceptable.
And, Congressmember, were you able to speak to the children or any of the people who are being detained?
No. When we got there, we very clearly were told you cannot speak to the children. There's to be zero conversation. Now, when we walked into the area where the prison cells are, that's what I call them, there's 5 or 6 of them, there was a door that had like plexiglass, and it went down pretty low. So you had a small boy, must have been 3 or 4 years old, run up to the plexiglass, in which case some of us got on our knees to be able to be face-to-face with this little boy. He was putting his hands up against the plexiglass to try to touch you, to say hello, try to communicate with you. You could see he was asking for his father. It was really heartbreaking to see what was happening, and we were not allowed to go into these cells and talk to the children.
But there was video from a Congressmember and chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Joaquin Castro, who recorded video on his cell phone during the visit to Border Patrol facilities in El Paso, Texas. The San Antonio Democrat said he refused to relinquish his phone to border agents to take video of detained immigrants and asylum seekers. In one video, you can hear Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez speaking to women in Spanish. If you can describe how the guards also responded, and respond to President Trump's tweet, where he said what you've described on the border in these various facilities is untrue. He said the people in the facilities that are jailed are very happy, and their condition in these jails, child jails and otherwise, are far better than from where they came from.
Well, the location where the video was taken was right before we got to Clint. And first of all, with the president's tweet, it's an outright lie. I have been there firsthand plenty of times. When I was there several months ago, I saw firsthand the overflow. I saw people packed into these prison cells. And so it is completely untrue. It's completely false what the president is saying. I would bet that he hasn't been to these locations and these places to see for himself how packed it is and to see the despair in people's eyes, the face of desperation. We got mobbed by women and their children asking for help. It is so heartbreaking to be there and to hear that and to not be able to say, let me help you, let me do something to relieve this pain and to put you in a better situation. The law enforcement officers that we were with that gave us this tour were very different this time around than they had been a couple of months ago when I went. Last time I went, they let me speak to the individuals, the parents. They let me even take a phone in. They let me take a photo with nobody's faces. This time around, very different. They confiscated telephones. They said you're not even allowed to talk to adults, and they try to prevent us from doing that. Now, as members, sometimes we're told that we get there and you try to talk to them. I speak Spanish, for example, and we'll try to just talk to them in the corner. And in this instance, demanded we be allowed to speak to the detainees and just heard their stories and their cries for help. And let me tell you why it's so critically important that members of Congress be able to speak to the detainees. Because what you hear from officials on the guided tour, what they want you to see and what they tell you is very different than when you start speaking to the detainees. We have had instances where they tell you they're getting plenty of diapers, they're getting this, but when you talk to the women, to the mothers, they will show you rashes from their children. They will tell you they're not getting enough diapers. They will tell you they're not getting the medical care that we're being told that they're getting. And so you can see photos of them show you toothbrush and diapers. That doesn't mean it's getting to the detainees or that they're being treated in a fair and dignified manner so that they can get a shower and they can be clean. We saw people who had not been clean, who had not showered several months ago. It was days on end. And it's disturbing. Everybody in this country should be outraged about how we are treating women and families and children and people who are escaping violence, coming here for asylum, which is legal in the United States.
Well, on Capitol Hill, House lawmakers heard heart-wrenching testimony Wednesday from the Guatemalan mother of a toddler who died after she became sick in an ICE jail near the U.S.-Mexico border. Yasmin Juarez says her 18-month-old daughter, Maria, was healthy when she brought her to the U.S. in March, seeking political asylum. But 1 week after the pair were jailed at the South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, Texas, the girl developed a cough, diarrhea, and vomiting with a fever that spiked at 104 degrees. Juarez says her daughter received inadequate medical care in a clinic set up in the center's gymnasium. After their release, Juarez rushed her daughter to the emergency room. She spent 6 weeks in hospital before she died of complications from a deadly lung infection. During her testimony, Juarez explained how she was treated by immigration officials.
After the interview, the ICE immigration official asked me why, for what reason I had come to the United States. I responded that I had come for my child's future, but they practically didn't let us talk. And he said, in these words, "You know this country is for Americans, that Donald Trump is my president, and that we can take your daughter away from you and lock you in jail." And I remember I just started to cry because I really didn't have any words to respond to them. To me, that is mistreatment. I'm here today because I don't want any more little angels to suffer the way Marie did, the way I am now. I don't want any more mothers or fathers to lose children. It can't be so hard for a country like the United States to protect children.
And this is more of what Yasmin Juarez told lawmakers on Wednesday.
All the hard work of these doctors came too late. My Marie died on Mother's Day, on the day that in my city, in my country, we celebrate Mother's Day. When I left the hospital that day, all I had with me was a piece of paper with Maria's handprints in pink paint that the staff had created for me. It was the only thing that I had left, just her handprints. The nurses had made it the previous day as a Mother's Day gift. There are days I just want to give up because for me, it is very, very hard to see so many children and for none of them to be my daughter and to think that I will never see her again or hug her or enjoy being with her or tell her just how much I love her. For me, that is very hard. You have no idea how hard it is to move forward without my little girl. They tore out a piece of my heart. They tore out my soul. And now I am suffering, and it is difficult for me to get up and move forward. I wanted a better future for her, to work hard and get ahead so that she could keep growing the way that she was. I can't do that now. I can't do that because she is gone.
So that was Yasmin Juarez speaking to lawmakers on Wednesday about her daughter who died just after being released from detention. Now, in the last year, 6 children have died in custody. And, of course, this little girl died just after she was released. And before last year, no child died in a decade. So, Congresswoman, could you comment on what's been happening in these facilities and why so many children have died?
Well, first, it's absolutely heartbreaking to hear the account of Ms. Juarez yesterday and her daughter. And this is what should move our lawmakers in our country to act so that they're not treated inhumanely. It's just an outrage. I'm almost speechless for words on what's happening. When you see the pattern of how these children are being treated, when you see that Flores decision where when children are being held longer than the 72 hours, when you hear the words of those in the administration about deterrence and how they're trying to deter, it's hard. It's hard not to think that this is being done in a situation, in a manner to make it as difficult as possible, as painful as possible, on how these children and how these families are being treated to try to deter people. And it's outrageous. We should not ever resort to violating human rights and practices to try to deter people from coming to this country. And that is what this administration has been focused on. It's the anti-immigration agenda. It's finding ways to deter people. And so they're slowing down the process. And that's why we have so many people right now in these prison-like conditions. that they're turning people away at ports of entry. And that alone is killing people, because then their desperation when they're waiting in Mexico, which is violent and people are experiencing just horrific situations there, they then come and travel between the ports of entry. Some of them are ending up in the Rio and dying. But in the facilities, when they get to this country and they're in these detention centers, they're not getting the treatment that they need, and they're not being processed out quickly enough. Part of that, I believe, is because of the administration's slowdown in processing people. We need to get more immigration judges. We need to invest in alternatives to detention. And this is something the administration has cut back on. They would rather jail people and house people, children and families, instead of allowing them to be reunited with their families here in the States. We know that. They have said that. And the result has been overcrowding. The result has been that people they're getting sick, and then they're going to die. I said that months ago when I saw the situation firsthand. I walked out of there and I said, people will die if this continues. You cannot put sick children in a room with other sick children. It's going to spread. That is common sense.
So, Congressmember, let me ask you about the growing rift, the increasingly public dispute between House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and 4 freshman congresswomen who are known as the Squad: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and Ayanna Pressley. Pelosi recently told the New York Times all these people have their public whatever and their Twitter world, but they didn't have any following. They're 4 people, and that's how many votes they got. Yesterday, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez told the Washington Post, when these comments first started, I kind of thought she was keeping the progressive flank at more of an arm's distance in order to protect more moderate members, which I understood. But the persistent singling out, it got to a point where it was just outright disrespectful, the explicit singling out of newly elected women of color. Can we get your response to this? Because certainly it is intensified over the whole issue of immigration.
Yes, there's a lot of tension going on. Certainly when the House supplemental bill came up versus the Senate supplemental bill came out, we were fighting to get provisions, guardrails, and provisions in there so that we could have some accountability and some oversight. When you're just handing out a blank check, it doesn't feel good. And then you see what's happening at the border, and it only then intensifies why we were fighting so hard to get these provisions in and these guardrails, as I like to call them, in. And so this has been the result of some, disagreement within the party on whether you give a blank check, whether you put the guardrails in there or not. I did not support, in the end, the Senate's version of the bill because it had no oversight provisions. It didn't have the very critical things that we needed as just a first step. And so this is going to be an ongoing issue. Absolutely.
Let me ask you about your response to Congressmember Ocasio-Cortez calling for the Department of Homeland Security to be dismantled. Here she's being interviewed by the New Yorker magazine editor-in-chief, David Remnick, and he asked her if DHS should be abolished.
I think so. I think we need to undo a lot of the egregious mistakes that the Bush administration did. I feel like we are it is a very qualified and supported position, at least in terms of evidence and in terms of being able to make the argument that we never should have created DHS in the early 2000s.
Congressmember Barragan, do you agree? Do you feel the Department of Homeland Security should be abolished?
I happen to sit on the Committee for Homeland Security, and Homeland Security is really big, and I think that is the problem. It oversees everything from the Secret Service, all FEMA rescue and recovery. It does human trafficking. It does, CBP officers at the ports of entry, airports and seaports. They're protecting this country from terrorist threats. So it is very big. And within that, you then have ICE and you have enforcement happening. And so there does need to be serious look at how do we restructure this? How do we break this up? How do we make it so that it's not so big and unmanageable? And we have seen that in various hearings in Homeland Security on the inability to see this really large agency. It's the largest law enforcement agency that does so many factors. So I have serious concerns with enforcement and ICE right now, and I think we certainly need to look at how do we fix these systemic problems and how do we restructure it so that it's not what it is now, which is a lot of abuses of people's rights and violations of human rights at the border.
And finally, the raids that apparently are about to take place, President Trump threatened them several weeks ago, and now it's being said, the New York Times is reporting Sunday, major immigration raids that people will be picked up who may be just in the area in 10 major cities. Can you tell us what more you know? I mean, as a Congress member, you have oversight. Do you know about this in places like in your home state in California and Los Angeles?
Well, we had a call. The Hispanic Caucus had a call about 3-4 weeks ago when the first reports were out that these were going to happen. We had a call with officials from Homeland Security about these reports. They wouldn't confirm or deny that they were going to happen, which to me led me to believe that they were going to happen. They wouldn't confirm or deny locations, but what they did say was exactly what's being reported, that they have targeted enforcement operations. However, they are going to pick up anybody along the way who they encounter. And this is a problem. Because this is why we have a funding issue. This is why there is so much disorganization within that department, because there is no more priorities. Instead of focusing on violent felons, they're focusing on everybody. And when you don't have no focus, it makes it that more challenging. So I am telling constituents to be alert, know your rights. So important right now that we go out and we tell people about resources to know their rights and not open the door, and to making sure that we're all vigilant. It's deeply concerning and troubling that the president and this administration are continuing to cause fear in our communities, which is making it unsafe.
And do you agree with Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, who in the last threat of these deportation raids said on Twitter, no Angelino should ever have to fear being snatched from their home or separated from their loved ones. We are doing everything we can to provide immigrant families with info and support ahead of the announced ICE deportation sweep, saying that the local authorities will not cooperate with ICE. Do you say the same, that the local authorities in California should not cooperate with ICE around these deportation raids?
I do agree. I do agree with the mayor on this, and we have to make sure that we are conveying this message to our communities right now, that we stand with them. ICE is a federal agency, and until they have a better system in place, and right now they have nothing, complete disorganization, we're going to continue to stand firm on this. This is wrong, and we are going to give as much information as we can to our immigrant and migrant family members and community members. It's pretty devastating to see the fear that's being caused.
Finally, Nanette Barragan, you're a well-known ball player in Washington, as in baseball, softball, member of the House Committee on Homeland Security, but also I wanted to ask you about the women's soccer team, their enormous second win, and the chants that went on yesterday through the Canyon of Heroes at the ticker tape parade. Yes, they said USA, and they added thousands of specifically girls, equal pay. Your thoughts on this and what Congress can do?
I think it's so great to see the women go out there and win, and I'm totally behind the effort of equal pay. You know, as you alluded to, I'm one of the 2 women in Congress who play on the men's baseball team. We need to be on the same level, get paid the same, be treated the same. I'm so proud of women's soccer and what they're doing right now to be the inspiration for young girls across this country. And so I'm so glad to see that we're going to continue the fight in Congress for equal pay. That is something that is impacting communities of color at a disproportionate rate as well. So we have a lot of work to do, and we need everybody on our team, including the U.S. women's soccer to stand with us, and they are at the forefront of this fight.
And, of course, the women's soccer team is headed to the Capitol. They haven't been invited to the White House by President Trump, even though they're the winningest soccer team. But Nancy Pelosi has invited them. We'll cover that. But when we come back, we're going to look at what the U.S. Women's Soccer World Cup win means for equal pay and for the future of Title IX. Stay with us.
Apenas nos pusimos en dos pies, comenzamos a migrar por la sabana, siguiendo la manada de bisontes, más allá del horizonte, a nuevas tierras lejanas. Los niños a la espalda y expectantes, los ojos en alerta, todo oídos, olfateando aquel desconcertante paisaje nuevo, desconocido. Somos una especie en viaje. No tenemos pertenencias, sino equipaje. Vamos con el polen en el viento. Estamos vivos porque estamos en movimiento. Nunca estamos quietos, somos trashumantes, somos padres, hijos, nietos y bisnietos de inmigrantes. Es más mío lo que sueño que lo que toco. Yo no soy de aquí.
Pero by the Uruguayan musician Jorge Drexler. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Thousands gathered in Manhattan yesterday to celebrate the U.S. women's national soccer team's 4th World Cup championship at a ticker tape parade that stretched up Broadway and past Wall Street. Megan Rapinoe, Alex Morgan, Rose Lavelle, and their teammates rode floats through New York City's Canyon of Heroes, ending their celebrations at a ceremony at City Hall. Supporters chanted USA and equal pay. The World Cup may be over, but it's only the beginning of the U.S. women's team's continued battle for equal pay and working conditions equal to the U.S. men's team. Prize money for this year's Women's World Cup is just $30 million compared to $400 million for the 2018 Men's World Cup.
The U.S. Women's World Cup victory came just months after members of the 2015 women's team sued the U.S. Soccer Federation over gender discrimination. This is co-captain Megan Rapinoe, the team's top scorer and best player, addressing the crowd at City Hall just after they received the keys to the city.
It's our responsibility to make this world a better place. I think this team does an incredible job of taking that on our shoulders and understanding the position that we have and the platform that we have within this world.
At Wednesday's ticker tape parade, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo signed pay equity legislation for New York State in a gesture of support for the women's soccer team. Just one day earlier, Senator Joe Manchin introduced legislation to withhold federal funding for the U.S. hosting the 2026 Men's World Cup until the women and men's teams receive equal pay. The U.S. women's team's high-profile fight for pay equity is focusing the spotlight on the pay gap for all women, not just soccer players. Women make 80 cents for every dollar paid to men. Black women make 61 cents for every dollar a white man makes. Native women make 58 cents. Latinx women make 53 cents. We are joined now by Julie Suk, professor of sociology at Graduate Center at CUNY. She's also dean for master's programs. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. So you're here in the city of the Canyon of Heroes, where the ticker tape parade took place. The women's soccer team, exultant and defiant, as the head of the U.S. Soccer Federation addressed the crowd at City Hall. He was met by chants of equal pay, equal pay. What does this movement, what does this call by the women's soccer team, yes, in the realm of soccer, mean for this country, for women around the country?
Well, I think their victory is a testament to some of the successes of Title IX in this country since the 1970s. And Title IX is very distinctive as anti-discrimination law in this country because it not only prohibits discrimination, it actually requires gender parity.
Explain what exactly Title IX is.
So Title IX is a statute that was passed in 1972, around the time that the Equal Rights Amendment was being sent to the states for ratification. And it's a statute that prohibits not only discrimination in educational programs receiving federal funding, but also prohibits the exclusion from participation on account of sex. And what that has meant in practice, because of the way that it's been interpreted through policy guidances, is that it's not enough just to say we're not discriminating on the basis of gender. Institutions, universities actually have to equalize conditions so that women and men really have an equal athletic opportunity in sports programs. And this has made a huge difference to the ability of women to participate in sports and eventually to excel over a generation so as to win the Women's World Cup.
And does that apply only to universities? It doesn't apply to schools, high schools?
Oh, it applies to all recipients of federal funding.
And do you agree that the women's soccer team won because precisely of this, of Title IX and what it enabled for women athletes?
I do, because I think that what Title IX shows is that if we're really committed on the ground to actual equality between men and women and have a very robust understanding of what that means, it means that we can unleash women's full potential. And there's so much talent that I think is not allowed to come out when we have unequal pay practices or when we have various practices on the ground that exclude women one way or another.
And what kind of legislation do you think is necessary to ensure a more equal pay for men and women?
Well, currently we do have Title VII in employment and the Equal Pay Act of 1963. And those are the statutes that the Women's National Team is invoking in their lawsuit that was filed that you mentioned. And those statutes do not go far enough because even though they require equal pay for equal work, there are a lot of exceptions, including if you pay men and women unequally based on any other factor other than sex, that's legal under the Equal Pay Act. Many other countries in recent years have passed more robust equal pay laws. For example, in France, they now have an equal pay index so that large employers will have to measure certain things, like the pay gap between men and women in the company, the number of women who have gotten raises after a maternity leave, those kinds of things. And they get a certain score. And if their score falls below a certain level, they have 3 years to fix it. And if they don't fix it, they could get fined up to 1% of payroll. So that's something that I think that's very robust that you're seeing in other countries that also have gender equality in their constitutions.
And talk about the state of pay and also of wealth, the disparity between men and women in the United States.
Well, I think it's a very complicated thing. One figure that we have is that women make 80 cents on the men's dollar, and it's due to a large range of factors. And that's white women. So, yeah, well, that's all women. That's all women. And then if you break it down, of course, then you get lower percentages as compared to men. But I think that a lot of the factors have to do not only with discrimination because of gender stereotyping and exclusion of women in certain programs from education all the way up to the workplace. It has a lot to do also with the effects of gender roles on women's careers and their earning abilities, including the fact that many women take career breaks in order to raise children. And because in this country we don't really have meaningful paid parental leave for men or for women, and this tends to have a pretty bad effect on women's earning ability over their careers. So that 80% is something that's complicated. It represents not only discrimination in the context of underpaying women for the exact same jobs, but broader disadvantages that have to do with the gender roles that women and men play in our society.
And how do you think, in fact, that compares to the extent that, of course, it's true that the U.S. has, among the OECD countries, among the worst provisions for maternity and paternity leave. To what extent is that, in fact, a reflection of how far we are here from gender equality? Because it kind of says something about how the role of the mother and the father, but principally the mother, given what you've said about gender roles, how much that's valued and how much space is made for it.
Absolutely. Economists who have studied the gender pay gap have suggested that if you control for maternity, the gender pay gap actually narrows significantly, So if you control, so that's to say that women who are not mothers make almost as much as men, whether they're fathers or not. And so you're absolutely right that our lack of accommodation for working mothers in this country, including our lack of a federal policy of paid parental leave. Right now, only, I believe, 11 or 12% of American workers have access to paid parental leave. And when the leave is not paid, that is, we have a Family and Medical Leave Act that authorizes unpaid leave up to 12 weeks. But when families have unpaid leave, the time that you have a baby is really not a good time not to be making any money. And what this usually means is that men continue to work and women take as short a period of time off as possible if they don't have access to paid leave. And this also has very bad effects on maternal health and infant mortality.
And finally, how does Title IX, how does equal pay in particular, how would these be affected by the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment? And explain what that is.
So the Equal Rights Amendment is an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was proposed almost 100 years ago, that says equality of rights shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So it prohibits the government from discriminating on the basis of sex. And what it would do is that it would make the government responsible and accountable for a wide range of governmental failures in the context of gender inequality. So obviously they would not be able to actually exclude women from any government programs or public educational programs on the basis of sex. But I think it could mean something more. That is, if you're not abridging equality of rights, it means that when we systematically fail to provide equal opportunities on the ground, that the government is somehow responsible. And I think that it would make sense then to have the kind of robust understanding of non-discrimination that you see in the context of Title IX, which has really produced results.
And what would it take to pass Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, right now? We
are so close because what it would take right now is one more state legislature to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. What happened when the Equal Rights Amendment was sent to the states for ratification was that we got 35 states before the deadline in 1982, and we need 38. And since 2017, Nevada has ratified and Illinois has ratified, and so if we have one more state, we'll have 38 states.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being with us. We'll certainly continue to follow that movement. Julie Suk, professor of sociology at Graduate Center at CUNY, the City University of New York. She's written about the ERA and about gender equality and constitutions across the world. When we come back, Labor Secretary Alex Acosta faces calls to resign over his handling of the Jeffrey Epstein serial child sexual assault case. Acosta is being criticized for cutting the budget to fight international sex trafficking by 80%. Stay with us.
Set me free and give me death, there ain't no other choices. When I lay down to go to sleep, I keep on hearing voices. Little whispers in my head, man, is you fake a lawyer? Why no water, death to sign a baby, pick your poison. These little demons living underneath my bed, creeping. Know the real monster lives above them all, sleeping. That subtle breathing in your closet every single evening. Thought you never see me again, looks can be deceiving. When they hear the sound of the drum, they'll be saying, oh Lord, here they come. Yeah, here we come. Here we come. Here we come. Here we come. I used to think that people die because they wicked. Nowadays, people want to see you dead because you gifted. Been ready for my tomb since I came up out the womb. So no matter what, I'm coming back and paying you a visit. Saw it coming, I predicted. But y'all wouldn't listen. No, you can't protect your riches if you never burn bridges. Flip pages, went places, made changes, still dangerous. Now I'm back, altercation, hold still. I make it painless how it feel, baby. When you say you love me, is it real, baby? Full speed, both hands on the
Drum by the hip-hop duo The Siege. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Labour Secretary Alexander Acosta is rejecting calls to resign and is defending his role in a 2008 plea deal given to the wealthy serial child sex abuser Jeffrey Epstein. At the time, Acosta was a U.S. prosecutor in Florida. The Miami Herald has described the plea deal as, quote, one of the most lenient deals for a serial child sex offender in history.
Acosta has also come under fire for his proposal to cut funding for victims of sex trafficking. His 2020 budget proposal for the Department of Labor includes an almost 80% decrease in funds for International Labor Affairs Bureau. Acosta was questioned when he held an almost-hour news conference to justify the extremely lenient deal he made with Epstein back in 2008 when he was the U.S. attorney in Florida. But this is what he said when questioned about the budget around sex trafficking.
As Labor Secretary, you've tried repeatedly to cut a program that deals with human trafficking in the Labor Department by up to 80%, going before Congress, advocating for that. Why should people trust you to focus on human trafficking and protect victims if you've done that? And I'd like a follow-up question.
So you're referring to grants that go to foreign countries for foreign country labor-related work. As part of the budget every year, those grants have been removed, as have other grants for foreign countries. And let me just add, as part of the budget every year, those grants are put right back in by Congress. This is what happens in Washington, and I fully suspect that those grants will remain in this year.
To talk more about Alex Acosta's record, we're joined now by Taina Bien-Aimé, Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. We're not as much talking right now about the case of Jeffrey Epstein, which we've talked about over the last few days, but this issue of his cutting of the budget. Can you explain what this means?
So the Department of Labor has a bureau called ILAB, which is the International Labor Affairs Bureau, and their primary responsibility is to combat forced labor, child trafficking, both labor and sex trafficking, and human trafficking in general. So what Secretary Acosta is saying that it goes primarily, that this money goes primarily to international programs is correct, but it also goes to domestic programs. So when if he slashes, so he has a budget of $68 million. What he is proposing is for the Bureau, ILAB, to be reduced by 80% to $18 million. Congress will fight him on that. The Appropriations Committee will fight him on that. But what it means is that we're faced with an administration that wants to reduce its efforts to this very complex human rights violation called human trafficking. So it's not just jeopardizing the work that we are doing to combat child sex trafficking, but also child labor trafficking. So many of the State Department also works on human trafficking and also provides services and programs to combat it. But they rely on DOL, on the Department of Labor, specifically for child labor trafficking. So, for instance, cocoa production, right? So there are three major U.S. companies, Hershey, Mars, and Nestle, that cannot even, they committed to ensuring to the consumers that no child labor trafficking is involved in the production of cocoa. What will happen to those commitments, right? We don't even know whether they are fulfilling their commitments to ensure that whenever you buy a bag of M&Ms or Skittles, that doesn't involve child trafficking.
Why is child sex trafficking and the whole issue of sex trafficking in the Department of Labor? I mean, it's very interesting. You have Acosta, who makes this extremely lenient deal with the child sex rapist, right, with Jeffrey Epstein, where he goes to jail for something like 11 months, but every day he can go out. His chauffeur picks him up to go to work, and this was in Florida. And, of course, he works for President Trump, who's been accused of sexually assaulting at least 17 women. Mm-hmm. But why is this in the Department of Labor?
Well, sex trafficking is dealt with in many agencies across the U.S. government, right? So labor was ILAB, which is, again, the bureau that specifically looks at human trafficking, which includes, as we know, human trafficking has many forms of exploitation. You have trafficking for labor, trafficking for sex, organ removal, situations of slavery and servitude, right? Well, so that is their mandate, to ensure that the U.S. develops programs that are well-funded to combat it, to prevent it, to suppress it.
And if it was cut by 80%, would it devastate the monitoring of and stopping of sex trafficking?
It would gut the program. Brown.
We're going to leave it there, but do part 2 and post online at democracynow.org. Taina Bien-Aimé, Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. Democracy Now! Currently has accepting applications for a year-long paid video production fellowship here in our New York studio. Check it out at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.